Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here, as always, to take a stack of sources, pull out the key knowledge, and deliver it straight to you. Today, we are doing a deep dive into character, communication, and, well, the really fascinating failure of collective advice. We're using the story of Job and that famous, or maybe infamous counsel from his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar.
That's right. And our source material, it frames this in an interesting way, kind of like the idea that, good ideas don't always come from the expected wise sources. So we're not really getting bogged down in the deep theology today. Instead, we're zooming in on the practical psychology, the human dynamics. The mission for you listening is to understand how these three, seemingly wise men came together with genuinely good intentions, and yet it ended up as a total communication disaster.
Yeah, and what makes it so compelling, I think, is that it starts so well. Not with anger or judgment, but with this act of almost like perfect friendship.
It absolutely does. When you look at Job chapter 2, the sources really emphasize the admirable starting point. These guys, Job's closest friends, they hear this awful news about the catastrophe that just wiped out Job's life. And they coordinate, they make plans to travel, meet up, specifically to mourn with him and comfort him. This is real, proactive friendship, getting themselves out there.
And then we get this contrast, which is just... It's stark. It's kind of shocking, actually.
Sure.
They arrive, and they sit with Job, literally, on the ground, in the dust, sharing his grief for 7 days and 7 nights, without saying a single word.
Just picture it, a full week of just being there. Silent company. The source material calls this silence truly worthy of respect, of admiration. It was like the ideal response to suffering, wasn't it? Just presence, bearing witness, no need to fix anything or explain or, interrupt the grief. That silence, it was pure empathy.
So they absolutely nailed the first week.
Yeah.
Which makes you wonder, if they understood the power of that silence, what happened? What pressure built up that made the talking part go so wrong?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? That's the paradox we need to dig into. That powerful, perfect silence, it breaks. And the moment they try to apply their understanding, their frameworks to Job's situation, everything just unravels. The analysis points out that these men were all older than Job. Yeah. And that seems important. It influenced their belief that, age equals authority.
Okay, let's unpack these different narrow views then. We have to start with Eliphaz, right? He's presumed to be the eldest, speaks first, kind of sets the tone.
Yeah, Eliphaz. He's the voice of, let's say, rigid tradition. His whole outlook was shaped by what our source calls a hard-boned theology. He saw God as this completely inflexible lawgiver. His system, it just didn't fail. Ever.
Okay, but what does hard-bone theology mean in practice? For someone who's actually suffering, like Job?
Well, it means there's no room for mystery. No room for grace, really. In Eliphaz's world, suffering isn't random. If something terrible happens, it has to be punishment, direct consequence for sin. So if Job suffered that much, the sin must be equally huge. Undeniable. There's just no space for the idea that, sometimes good people suffer terribly, or that grace might operate outside this strict transaction of cause and effect. It's like an accounting system. Everything has to balance perfectly. If you're in the red, you messed up, full stop. And bringing that kind of brittle, unforgiving frame to someone who's lost everything, it's rough.
Very rough. Okay, then we move to Bildad, the middle voice. If Eliphaz was brittle, Bildad sounds, almost actively cruel in his certainty.
Bildad is labeled the strong legalist. Yeah, cruel might not be far off in effect. He wasn't just content to accuse Job. He needed to prove the mechanical certainty of this divine law. And what's particularly chilling, and the analysis really highlights this, is that Bildad was so committed to that sin punishment link that he looked at Job's dead children and concluded they must have sinned. That's why they died.
Wait, hang on. He doesn't just accuse his suffering friend, he blames the dead kids just to make his theory work.
Precisely. The source notes he seemed completely unmoved by Job's actual pain. His entire focus was preserving the integrity of his theological formula. It wasn't about comforting his friend, it was about being right. You see the difference? Diagnosing a problem versus comforting a person. Bildad. All diagnosis. Even if it meant this horrific collateral damage, blaming dead children just to keep his system neat and tidy.
Wow. That's the point where the friendship just shatters, isn't it? He put his rules above the relationship. Okay, finally, the youngest of the three, but maybe the most aggressive. Zophar. Sounds like he delivered the final dogmatic smackdown.
Zophar definitely represents the extreme doctrinal stance. The source describes him as speaking like an old, stuffy professor lecturing clueless freshmen. Zero empathy. Just none. And he didn't just imply Job sinned, he told Job straight up that God was actually being merciful, that the suffering Job endured was less than what his sins truly deserved.
Wow. That's basically an accusation wrapped up in fake grace, isn't it? Designed to just crush you into agreeing.
It's pure emotional manipulation disguised as doctrine.
Yeah.
And here's a little detail the analysis picks up on. Zophar only speaks twice in the whole long debate, which might suggest, well, either he felt his case was just unanswerable, or maybe he just couldn't handle Job's reasonable responses and decided, this guy's a lost cause. Washed his hands of it.
So looking at the three of them, Eliphaz, the unforgiving traditionalist, Bildad, the harsh legalist, Zophar, the doctrinal bully, they all had slightly different angles, but the source is clear. They shared one single core flaw that made all their advice totally useless.
Yeah, what's interesting is that, taken out of context, some things they said about God's power or justice might technically be correct, abstractly. But their common error, the fatal flaw, was approaching Job with this one single, rigid, pre-decided filter, the principle of sin and law.
Right. They weren't trying to actually understand the complexity of this guy's tragedy. They were trying to cram Job's life into their little pre-approved box. They already had the answer. They just needed the facts to fit.
Exactly right. They desperately needed Job to confess, to name some sin, any sin. Why? So their theology could be proven right, so the world would make sense again according to their rules. They were basically trying to emotionally blackmail him, coerce him into giving them the confession they needed for their own intellectual comfort. And Job's refusal to just make something up, to lie, to protect their fragile worldview. That's what drove them nuts.
That sounds exactly like confirmation bias playing out in a friendship. If your theory is rigid, any evidence against it just gets thrown out as wrong or dishonest?
It is. The analysis really hammers this point. The problem wasn't a lack of information. It was the sheer narrowness of their perspective. The source even quotes this saying, which fits perfectly here: if your viewpoint is narrow enough, nothing is impossible to prove. Think about it. If you start absolutely fixed on the idea that all suffering must equal sin, you'll twist every fact, ignore every nuance, even blame the dead if you have to, until reality fits your premise.
Which brings us right to the practical takeaway for us today, doesn't it? This isn't just some ancient story. It's a frankly terrifying lesson in how not to communicate. Whether you're trying to help a friend, manage a team, talk to family, whatever.
Absolutely. The key advice that comes out of dissecting this failure really connects what we say to the breadth of the heart, the source calls it, or spaciousness of mind. If your mind is narrow, if your system is brittle and can't handle complexity, your words will inevitably reflect that. They'll be narrow, judgmental, and ultimately hurtful.
So, if the advice, the counsel, really comes from a place of love, then tolerance has to be part of it. But how do you tell the difference between offering, necessary tough love and just imposing your own limited view on someone?
That's the crucial distinction, isn't it? The error, highlighted right there in the source material, is rushing to judgment based on our own emotions, our own quick temper, even when we tell ourselves we're just speaking the truth in love. That honest truth we think we're speaking, often it's just our very limited personal understanding of what happened. It's our framework. It's not necessarily the actual bigger truth or, the divine will or whatever you want to call it. We mistake our tiny worldview for the grand, messy reality.
That's a huge point. Our framework isn't the same as objective fact. So when someone's struggling, our first job isn't to slap our structure onto their pain, is to try and understand the shape of their experience.
Exactly, and the friend's big mistake was amplified by their age, their seniority. The source specifically warns about this danger, acting superior due to age, essentially pulling rank. They thought their years automatically gave them the right to dictate the terms of suffering and demand a confession.
They basically tried to play God, didn't they? Or at least play the role of cosmic judge. They weren't offering comfort, they were demanding conformity.
They were. Because their intellectual peace, their tidy worldview, required Job to be guilty. When we assume our experience gives us all the answers, we shut ourselves off. We lose the ability to see that maybe, just maybe, the person in front of us is going through something outside our neat little box. And that's when guidance turns into accusation. Friendship turns into judgment.
It seems pretty clear then. The path to better communication, to real help, means letting go of that rigid need to be right and embracing a much wider view.
It requires more tolerance, yeah, a broader heart, a more spacious mind. The ultimate lesson here for building relationships, any relationship, is that this kind of broad-mindedness, this tolerance, leads to more unity, more harmony. If you approach a tough conversation, ready to listen, ready to accept things that don't immediately fit your system, you avoid the trap that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar fell right into.
So this whole deep dive leaves us with this really striking paradox, doesn't it? Job's friends start with 7 days of perfect silent support, the absolute gold standard for responding to suffering. But then they completely undermine that amazing start with words that were narrow, judgmental, lacking compassion, all because they needed certainty for themselves.
Right. The most critical lesson for you, listening, has to be recognizing the limits of your own understanding. We just don't know everything. And realizing the need to approach others, especially when they're hurting, with that broad-mindedness we talked about. Our job as friends, as colleagues, often isn't to provide the neat, tidy answer that makes us feel comfortable, but simply to offer comfort, presence, and tolerance without demanding that their reality must conform to our expectations.
Couldn't agree more. So we'll leave you with a final thought to chew on, pulling directly from the questions posed in our source material. Next time you face a really tough problem, personal or professional, maybe ask yourself this: which 3 trusted friends would you actually turn to? And perhaps even more importantly, thinking about Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, the rigid traditionalist, the heartless legalist, the dogmatic accuser-ask. What's the one toxic trait you absolutely need to avoid when you are the one trying to be a friend to someone in deep need? That's something to really think about.